Your salary is not stability, and it's actually your single biggest risk. And what's crazy is the more you earn, the worse it gets. And no, you're not imagining it. That uneasiness you feel on Sunday evenings, the way you catch yourself scrolling job boards at midnight, even though you're not actively job hunting, the fact that you're objectively doing well to literally everybody else, you may have a good salary, a respectable title, but you still can't shake the feeling that something's off. Let's be real for a second. A lot of us did exactly what we were told to do. We studied hard, we got the degree, we landed the job, we kept our heads down and delivered the results and climbed the ladder and put in blood, sweat and tears. And yet here we are, supposedly stable, but somehow feeling shittier than ever. And I used to think there was something wrong with me, that I was experiencing some sort of life crisis related psychosis, but over time I realized I was just noticing what's been true for a while. The model doesn't work like it used to. Stability used to be a given when you entered the workforce. Now it feels temporary or conditional, like you're one restructure, one merger, one strategic alignment away from having to prove your worth all over again. There were so many nights I would lay awake wondering, is this really it? Like, why do I feel like the best years of my life are just evaporating into spreadsheets and status meetings? There was something about this feeling that I just couldn't shake. And it wasn't rooted in fear, it was something else. My brain was figuring out that the ground beneath me wasn't as solid as everyone had made it out to be. And in truth, I don't think anyone feels relaxed about work anymore. Not when you're on 50K, not when you're on 150K. The number can change, but the underlying tension doesn't, because the issue isn't the amount, it's the structure itself. So then the question becomes, why did I even equate my salary with stability in the first place? Because that wasn't necessarily stupid or misguided. It was context specific, because there was a time when the model genuinely worked. Like, my dad spent over 20 years in the automotive industry with the same company. My aunt spent over 20 years in the fashion industry with the same company. And for them, and for most of that generation, and for people with first and second generation immigrant families, finding a good job was the sensible thing to do. It was the sensible advice. It was how we define success. And it made sense because the world they were building careers around operated differently. Economies moved slower, careers were linear, companies were anchored by geography. They weren't as globally fluid as they are today. Loyalty actually bought you something, like a pension scheme that wasn't just theoretical, or redundancy packages that actually reflected your years of service. Your parents, or mine, gave great advice based on that world. Get a good job, work hard, stay loyal, and you'll be looked after. And they weren't lying. That advice did work for them in their context, but the problem is, the world has moved on and the advice didn't. The companies changed the deal without announcing it. The promise of stability remained in language, in branding, in how we still talk about good jobs. But the underlying mechanics have completely shifted. We keep playing by the old rules without realizing that the game has completely changed. And listen, the stability model was rational for the conditions it existed in. But applying those rules now in this economy with these employment structures is just stupid, because things have changed and nobody even noticed, particularly how risk shows up in the employer relationship. It didn't disappear, it just moved. And it happened so slowly and so quietly that most of us just innocently inherited it without anyone renegotiating the terms. Companies, for example, are now structurally designed to remain agile at all costs. Layoffs aren't seen as failures in leadership anymore. Restructures aren't abnormalities. AI adoption that eliminates roles isn't just some dark outlier. These are features and incentives and how modern businesses stay competitive these days. How many times have you heard about that new startup that gets acquired and they almost brag about how little staff they have? This is real. And what changed is this: employment is no longer designed to absorb volatility. That function has been transferred to you, the employee. You trust that 20 years of loyalty counts for something, but when it's actually time for the layoffs to happen, for the redundancies to happen, quite often the payouts, the way people are treated is quite frankly insulting. And what's worse about all of this is corporate culture still uses language that tricks us to make it feel like things are more palatable than they are. They will say that, this round of layoffs is just business. And that phrase does a lot of work. It makes a decision sound neutral or rational or even inevitable. But what it really means is your stability is secondary to their flexibility. Workers are still expected to be all in, to be committed, to be loyal, to be available, but companies aren't structured to reciprocate that. The commitment is all on you by design. Headcount became a lever, not a responsibility. You're an asset when it suits them and a cost when it doesn't. Stability used to be structurally baked into the employment contract. Now it's just an abstract thing that they allude to keep people engaged. And if you, the individual, now hold all of that risk, if you're the shock absorber for market volatility, technological change, strategic pivot, then concentrating all your income in one place isn't stability. It actually leaves you very, very fragile. A salary actually concentrates all of that risk, and it doesn't matter how large it is. Think about what a salary actually represents. One payer, one decision maker, one context where your skills are recognized as valuable. If you had a financial advisor who told you to put 100% of your investments into a single stock, you'd probably call them reckless. If you ran a business that relied entirely on one client, you'd call that like a crisis waiting to happen. But somehow, when it comes to income, we've normalized exactly that structure and called it responsible. Your salary might be comfortable, might even be impressive, but as you become more senior, you become more specialized, more embedded in a specific context. Your skills get translated into internal language that doesn't always transfer externally. You might be brilliant at navigating your company's politics, driving results within their systems, managing their specific stakeholders, but how much of that capability is actually transferable? If you had to leave tomorrow, could you articulate your value in a way that makes sense outside that building right now? Because the uncomfortable truth is internal value and external value aren't the same thing. You can be essential to your company and simultaneously struggle to explain what you do in a way that translates to money in the real world. And the gap between how valuable you are inside the system and how valuable you appear outside of it, that's the risk, because it gets harder to ignore the longer you stay. Because the more senior you become, the more your identity gets wrapped up in the title and the context. And it took me a long time to realize that if this was solvable by effort alone, then promotions would fix it. But sadly, they don't. Earning more inside the same structure just compounds the same risk. It doesn't eliminate it. Promotion feel like progress, and they are, okay, financially at least, but they also deepen the lock-in, the identity lock-in, the psychological lock-in that makes the idea of starting over feel impossible. When I finally left my corporate career, I thought I'd already detached. I thought I'd done the internal work, that I'd made the decision, but the identity piece, that was a lot harder than what I expected. My job wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. I was the eldest daughter who had their shit together, the one that was good with money, the one that people came to for advice. So starting from scratch in a completely different space meant facing every anti-vision of myself that I knew to be true, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I'd made a mistake, that I didn't have it together. And that cognitive load is real. And the further you climb inside one system, the heavier it gets. I could see exactly where the ladder was going. More workload, more politics, more code switching, more effort that inevitably leads to somewhere I didn't really want to be. So what's the answer? Not to try, just give up, collect the check and like quietly quit and quietly stop caring? Well, no, I don't think effort is the problem. I think effort inside the wrong structure is the problem. So what does that actually mean? Like, what is the wrong structure? Well, it's not just that you're at the wrong company or in the wrong industry. It's that the entire employment model is designed to make you valuable in a way that doesn't transfer. You've probably spent years getting good at things that only matter inside one context. You learn their language, their systems, their way of measuring success. You become essential. And that feels like progress, like you're building something. But what you're actually building is expertise that becomes impossible to explain the moment you step outside of that world. And I didn't realize this until I tried to describe what I did as a chief of staff to someone outside of my industry. For example, I would say things like, I arrange complex travel. travel. Yes, that's accurate, but what does that actually mean? What it meant in reality was managing 100k budgets, coordinating specialist travel like jets, helicopters, yachts, staffing them, building relationships with vendors who could deliver at that level, managing intricate preferences down to making sure the jet had a specific brand of water on board, that the driver would remind the principal of a call that they needed to make at exactly the right moment, and a million other things. That's relationship management. That's high stakes logistics, budget oversight, and obsessive attention to detail, operating under serious pressure. Those are all commercially valuable skills, but flattened into arranged complex travel. When you say it like that, it just sounds so unremarkable, so generic, like anyone could do it. Even my best friends couldn't really tell you what I actually did. They knew I was important, they knew that I was senior, but if you asked them to describe my day-to-day at my job, they would literally have no idea where to start, because I'd learned to describe my work in a way that only makes sense inside a particular system. It's like the language I used to talk about my value actively obscured what I was actually good at. And I came to realize that the structure isn't wrong because it's hard. It's wrong because it conditions you to speak about your capability in a way that only works in one place. And the better you get at that language, the less you can articulate your value outside of that one context. So for example, titles like senior manager tell you almost nothing about what you actually do or what problems you solve. It's literally just a positional marker useful for internal hierarchy, okay? Completely useless for anybody else outside your company. Or take phrases like you supported the team or contributed to strategic initiatives or facilitated cross-functional alignment. These phrases feel substantial in performance reviews, but they literally mean nothing outside of your company. What's actually happening beneath that language is you drove a specific outcome. You reduced a cost. You created a process that saved time. You identified a problem and fixed it. You managed complexity that would have derailed something important. That's the commercial value, but it's been translated into corporate jargon where the clarity just disappears, and most people can't explain what they do without referencing their role. They'll say, I'm a project manager at X company, or I work in operations for Y brand. And this matters because when you try to think about earning outside of that structure, it feels really fucking vague and uninteresting. Because you think, maybe I'll do a side hustle, but do what? Maybe you'll try freelancing, but in what capacity? Or consulting, but on what exactly? And if you don't understand your skills, you can't start, because you do solve problems, you do manage complexity, you do drive outcomes, you do create systems, you do handle difficult situations. These are all things that are commercially valuable, but you can't see them clearly because the language you've been given to describe your work deliberately hides your value. So for example, if somebody asked you right now, what are you excellent at that someone would pay you for outside of your current job? Could you answer it clearly, like without hedging, without referencing your title or your company? Because a lot of people can't. Jobs teach you to see their value through their lens, and that lens is deliberately narrow. And if you can't translate your value, you can't redeploy it. And if you can't redeploy it, then you're kind of stuck. And what I really want you to take away from this video is that modern stability isn't singular. It's actually layered. Stability now comes from optionality, from transferability, from actually knowing what you're worth on the open market, not just inside the bubble of your current employer. Now, this doesn't mean everyone needs multiple income streams or to become an entrepreneur, but everyone needs multiple options, and that is the difference. You might love your job, you might plan to stay there for years, and that's fine, but the question isn't whether you want to leave, it's whether you could. Do you know what your skills are worth elsewhere? Could you articulate your value in a way that makes sense outside of your current context? If your company restructured tomorrow, would you have any idea how to monetize what you already know? That's the shift, okay? Stability used to be about certainty, knowing you'd be employed. Now that's basically out of your control, and it's about leverage. And that means when your company announces a restructure, you might be concerned, but you're not going to have a mental breakdown because you've already mapped 3 different ways you could generate income if you needed to. You haven't necessarily acted on them, but you know they exist. And that means you negotiate your salary differently. You're not negotiating from, I need this job. You're negotiating from, I'm choosing to work here and I could choose differently if I wanted 2022. And what's interesting is when you know you could earn elsewhere, it changes how work feels because you don't feel so trapped anymore. There's a difference between choosing to stay and having no other choice. And deep down, you know you should have options, but often we just can't see what those options would even be. We look at our resumes and we see job titles, not capabilities. We see experience and time served, not commercial value. And that gap between understanding you need optionality and actually knowing what your options are, that's where clarity matters. And design starts with clarity, not execution. A lot of us rush to action something to escape discomfort. And in doing so, we make the worst possible decisions. The thing about clarity is it feels slow. It feels like you're not doing anything. But it saves years because without clarity, people just chase ideas that don't fit them. They underprice themselves because they don't know what their skills are actually worth. They burn energy on things that look productive, but don't actually move them towards real optionality. You need to know what you have before you can figure out what to do with it. That's what my skills to income blueprint does. And you'll find the link to it below this video, okay? It's a diagnostic, a translation layer. It shows you how to use the skills you've been using already in your day-to-day job and tells you what those skills are worth externally. Not what you wish you had, not what you need to learn, what you already have right now. And what it gives you is visibility into what you're actually good at beyond your title. Which of those skills are transferable? Where do they already have market value? Because the problem isn't that you lack capability. The problem is you just can't see what you have clearly. The skills to income blueprint shows you what's transferable, what's monetizable, what the market actually values outside of the constraints of traditional employment. Because once you see clearly, the next steps become obvious. Not easy, but obvious. Because the biggest risk in this current climate isn't instability. It's dependency disguised as safety, because the world isn't going back to predictable employment. That model is gone because the incentives for businesses don't support that anymore. Businesses are optimizing for agility because shareholders demand it. Technology enables it. The structural forces are clear, which means security, real security, now comes from understanding leverage, from knowing what you're worth, where your skills apply, and how to translate what you do into something that exists outside one employer's assessment of your value. And more importantly, optionality changes how you show up everywhere, in salary negotiations, in team dynamics, in how you think about your future. That shift from dependency to design, that's the difference between feeling exposed and feeling secure. Stability isn't something you're handed anymore. It's something you have to architect. So if this was interesting for you, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.